准时开，所以如果你哪一次想要进来的话，如果进不来的话，请你过几分钟再试试看 ，OK？ And another thing is I talked about Travel Talk on October 22nd. It was scheduled for November 5th or November 12th, but now we switch back because the speaker who was supposed to be giving the talk this weekend got COVID-19. So I'm back to my old slot. So there's no change in the schedule. And if you are a member of King On's line group, then you can see all these changes, or you can receive email about the weekly newsletter. So make sure you have a way of knowing when there's any change in the schedule.
So there's no naturopathic speech this weekend?
That's correct. Yeah, the person is sick with COVID-19. He is able to give the talk, but he would be coughing all the time. So he thought it's not a good idea.
Well, you need to take naturopathic medicine now.
Yeah. Okay. So if you want to receive an email from King On or want to join a line group, you can contact any one of us, or at least you can send email to me and I'll try to hook you up with them. Okay, and today, the first slide is always that on Wednesday, the first and third Wednesday of the month, we have an English class at 2 p.m. and it is streamed on King On channel live. And it's recorded to be put on King On channel later for many years to come, okay? And before we start the movie, I want to mention that Angela Lansbury died last week at age 96 after a career of more than 7 decades. She was really, her long life made her career very interesting indeed. She was a pretty young thing on the left-hand side in this picture. And I don't know when this portrait of her was from, but it was when she was much older. And I've seen so many things of her. She is a very versatile, let me put this word here, versatile actress, which means that she does not restrict her roles in a certain category. For example, a pretty young thing is one category, and many young girls started out playing the pretty young thing, which is usually called the ingenue. So in the story, whether it's a movie or a play, there is usually an innocent young girl and pretty, and that's called an ingenue. That's a French word for it. And many actresses started that way. And I first saw her in Samson and Delilah as Delilah's sister. And of course, in the Bible, Delilah did not have a sister, but of course, they tried to make the story more interesting. Anyway, so she played pretty young girls for a while. Then she branched out into playing many different kind of roles. And as she describes it, her roles spanned bitches on wheels and people's mothers. So on the spectrum of all women, she played the worst, the very bad, nasty women, and she played somebody's mother and everything in between. So she is a very versatile actress. Under the second bullet, it says that her roles including Mrs. Lovett, the maker of human flesh pies in the Broadway play Sweeney Todd in 1979, and as Lawrence Harvey's evil mother in the film The Manchurian Candidate. So these are two of the very nasty roles that she played, but most of the time she plays a nice old lady nowadays, but that's before she died. And later on, like 20, 30, 40 years after she became an actress, she became very famous for playing the leading role in a TV series on BBC, I suppose, called Murder, She Wrote. It was an adaptation of Agatha Christie's many murder mystery stories. And we talked about Agatha Christie last time, 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, yeah, exactly. Let me look back at the beginning. In the first bullet, her first film roles in Gaslight, National Velvet, and The Picture of Dorian Gray earned her 2 Academy Award nominations and a Golden Globe Award. So she started out immediately becoming very famous, even though they were not important roles, because in Gaslight, the main leading actress was played by Ingrid Bergman, and in National Velvet, it was a vehicle of Elizabeth Taylor when she was a child. And I couldn't imagine what she played in The Picture of Dorian Gray, because it was about a very handsome young man who gradually became bad and old, but because of a deal he made with devil, he remained very good looking. However, the portrait of him became older and older, the person in that portrait. And that is a very strange story by Oscar Wilde. We call him Wang. He's a very brilliant playwright, and he's Irish, I believe, but he writes plays in England, in London. So Angela Lansbury, her career spanned decades and decades, 70 years, something like that. And she started out like any other pretty young girls, but then she became older and she played many different roles. And she died as a very well-respected actress. There are a lot of actresses who appeared and then they were gone after they got married. They never showed up in any movies. I would say, and my unscientific statistic, what I did was guessing that at least 50% of the young girls were like that. They got married and they disappeared and they were never in any movies. So it is quite amazing to see a woman who continued on and on in movies for decades on end, like Angela Lansbury. And if you look at The Manchurian Candidate, she was in it as an evil mother in 1962. And that movie was remade in Hollywood, with her role being played by Meryl Streep. And Meryl Streep is a very well-known and respected and has a very long-lasting, successful career. Okay, now we put her aside and we started to talk about our movie of the day, which is Cinderella. Cinderella is translated into Hui Gunyang, and as we look at the history of the story, Hui Gunyang is a good translation of Cinderella, which means a young girl covered with ash. So she is a nobody. She's always in the kitchen cooking and sweeping and doing things like that. And then the story, of course, changed when she met the handsome young prince who's looking for a bride, and she was able to get married and became a queen. And the movies I've suggested you to watch are one of the two, which are the same version, not the same version, but they were based on the same musical called the Cinderella. And the one that's more recent, I mean, it's not the first one. The first one was Julie Andrews in 1957, but the one we saw in 1962 has Leslie Ann Warren playing Cinderella, and it's a better edition. It obviously costed more to produce with more better setting and more better costumes and better of everything, and a lovely young girl, Leslie Ann Warren, who was 18 years old. Julie Andrews was 22 when she showed up in this first edition of this musical. It was many years before she became famous, but everyone in the business knew that she would one day become a huge star. That's why Rodgers and Hammerstein, they agreed to write a new musical just for her, because they knew that she would one day be a great star, and they were happy to write something just for her. They really broke their tradition of writing for a musical on stage first. All their musicals were written first for the stage and then adapted into a movie, and never was any of them on TV, let alone on the TV for the first time. But when they heard that CBS was looking to find a vehicle, a vehicle is a car, okay? When we say vehicle, we mean a car. But for an actor who shows up in a certain role and it becomes well received and famous and so on, that movie is called a vehicle of this actor, okay? So when Rodgers and Hammerstein were hired by CBS to write a new TV musical, for Julie Andrews, they very happily agreed to do it. But it's not so elaborately done, so you can see that it does not have all the wonderful songs that people love in this show. And it was very short. Most of the musicals that was adopted to become a film, almost all of them were because they were so popular on stage that the investors wanted this movie to be a big, big hit. So the money just poured in so they can make a very fancy movie. But this one is just the other way. It was written for a small play and was on the TV for the first time. And as you could see, it's not a huge production. So this is we call it an anomaly, which means abnormal. So when you watch Julie Andrews in this play on TV, you must be surprised to see it's so Spartan. We say it's Spartan. Spartan is a Sparta. In the ancient Greece, there were many, many city-states all around by the sea. And the biggest two cities were Athens and Sparta, 就是雅典跟斯巴达这两个国家 they were the biggest city-states, because each state is just a city. They were two of the biggest city-states in ancient Greece. And Athens had Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, 苏格拉底 亚里士多德跟柏拉图 and all those wonderful playwrights and Homer, who wrote long epic poems. All these wonderful things represent ancient Athens. On the other hand, Spartan is just full of warriors. They are good at fighting, but they are low on cultural heritages. And so when we say this show is very Spartan, we say it's not fancy. It doesn't have florists, lots of beautiful languages and songs and production, costume, and all those things. And we say this play is Spartan. So this play is none of those things. That's what you see in this Julie Andrews musical on TV. It is very simple. Now that we see it, it's only black and white, but when it was produced and broadcast live on TV, many versions were were colored, but not all of them. And one of the colored camera malfunctioned, so it was having problem doing that. That was a very early time, 1957, when they started to have live broadcast on TV. So they did not have a way to record it in color, and they did not actually record anything from that live broadcast. What they did was there was a taping of a rehearsal, which was black and white, and that's what you see now on YouTube. It was also available. It is also available as DVD, but it's obviously on YouTube that you all watched. So this Cinderella in 1957 was only a recording of a rehearsal in black and white. So compared to that, the Leslie Ann Warren version is much, much better. And she being a very lovely young girl, this version is also delightful to watch. So the people, those that I talked to in the class already told me, in fact, my sister told me that she liked the later version, and so do I, because it was a better version. Of course, when you watch Julie Andrews sing, there's no comparison. She sings so well. There's hardly anybody in the world who can sing better than Julie Andrews. So Leslie Ann Warren, she was a good singer, but in no way she could compare with Julie Andrews. But I think she did a very good job. What do you think? Okay. So we have these two versions you could see on YouTube, and there is another one which is based on the same material, also called the Cinderella, based on Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. It was done in 1997, so it's much later, like 30 years later than Leslie Ann Warren's version. And it's also available on YouTube, but you have to pay for it. You pay for the streaming right. And this is a very interesting version. I don't think I watched it, even though I heard it at that time. And we'll talk about each version as we go along. And here I'm showing you, wrong button, okay. I'm showing you two slides, these two slides that I don't expect you to read. It's just to show you how many movies based on Cinderella were on the, or exist in this world. As early as 1899, that's more than 100 years ago. The first one they could find was a French film. Of course, at that time, there was no color, there was no sound. All the way through 1930, all these were probably silent movies, maybe except the last one. But these are silent movies and black and white movies. That's how old they were. Like Mary Pickford, the second one is a silent film by Mary Pickford, who is a very pretty young girl. That was in 1914, okay. But if you go down, there are Russian and Mexican and Indian and many other countries also produced such stories, but none as many as the United States. And we have 1950 and 55 and so on and so forth. So there are many. We're not going to go through them. And these are the television Cinderellas. And then there are, if you can see my cursor, and there are ballets, and there are musicals, and there are operas. All these different genre of Cinderella. So it is indeed a very popular story to be adapted into other media. Okay. So let's talk about the origin of the story. How old is the story? We all know that it appeared in Brother Grimm's fairy tales, the German brothers who collected the folk tales and grouped them into fairy tales of Brothers Grimm. 这是格林童话. However, there was at least several before that in other countries, but the very oldest one was in the 1st century or even before the 1st century. It was a Greek geographer whose name is Strabo. He wrote down a story which is very similar to this. When we say very similar, we mean a poor, neglected young girl suddenly became the queen because of marriage. That's a basic storyline. But in this story, almost always there is the thing about the shoes. She lost the shoe at the party or festival or the ball. And the princess found this shoe and followed it, went on the search for her. So almost all of these stories have all these elements in the story, as old as more than 2,000 years ago. So that's the earliest known version of the Cinderella story. As to Western Europe, they could find one in Italy in 1634, and one in French, written in French language, in 1697. And then the later one was in 1812 by Brothers Grimm. So these are three important ones in Western Europe. And they were really late, the oldest being only 400 years old compared to the other one, which is more than 2,000 years old. And there are many in between, but in the Western culture, they look at Italy or Germany or French. So these three are the more important to the Western world. The first one is in Italy, and it was written by this person, Giambattista Basile, in his novel called The Pentameroni. And you look at this, I've never heard of it before, and I don't know what it was, but I look at Decameroni, or you can say Decameron, which is more common in English language. Decameron is Boccaccio's 十日谈. Boccaccio is in early Renaissance, an Italian writer, and his very famous story is called the Decameron. That is the English way to pronounce it. And without the E, you would pronounce it as Decameron. And with an E, you would pronounce it as a Decameroni, okay? And you look at this Cinderella story, it was in Pentameroni. So a penta means 5, because the Defense of Department of Defense in United States is located in a building called the Pentagon, 五角大厦. So the word penta means 5, while the word deca, the prefix deca, means 10. So Boccaccio wrote Decameron, which we translate into Chinese as 十日谈. And by the same reasoning, you could induce that Pentameroni is 五日谈. I assume that he's talking about a group of people together in some isolated location, and they started to tell their story in 5 days. And the collected story is called the Pentameroni. Just like an English writer or poet, Chaucer. Chaucer went to Italy in the 14th century, and he was familiar with all these things written in Italy, like Decameron or the Divine Comedy, which is by Dante, 神曲, all these wonderful Latin stories that were written in during the early part of Renaissance. And Chaucer went there as a diplomat from England, and he came back and he wrote the Canterbury Tales. That was the English version of Decameron, about a group of people, probably more than 10, and they went on a pilgrimage to how do you call that, Kent, the big church in Kent. It slipped my mind. Anyway, there was a Becket, Thomas Becket, who was assassinated in the church. That's why people would go to that church for a pilgrimage. And the Chaucer wrote this story about these pilgrims who went on a pilgrimage to that church. Okay. And the next one happened like 60 years later in French. It was written by French, by Charles Perrault. And so when you had operas about Cinderella, they were not called the Cinderella. The one written by Rossini, who's Italian, is called Cenerentola, while the one written by Jules Massenet who is French, is called the Cendrillon. That's because in French, the Cinderella story is called the Cendrillon, while in Italy, the Cinderella story was called the Cenerentola. And all these means 灰姑娘, the girl in ash. And same with the story written by Brothers Grimm. That story was called the Ashen something, which means a girl in ash. So these are the more modern Cinderella stories in Italy, in France, and in Germany. And of course, nobody can tell stories better than Disney, I suppose. So there are Disney cartoons and later more Disney movies about Cinderella, but they were not called the French, Italian, or German names. They were called the Cinderella. Here I got two movie posters about the story of the Grimm Brothers. On the left-hand side, I've seen this movie with Lawrence Harvey as the older brother. And this movie is called The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm. But it's not a German movie. It's about the German story. It's a story about two German brothers, the Brothers Grimm. But Lawrence Harvey is English. And on the right-hand side, it's much more recent. It was in the year 2005 with Matt Damon and Heath Ledger. This movie did not sell very well, but it is about these two brothers who collected folk tales, and the collection became very popular all over the world. When I was in elementary school, I read all their stories from the beginning to the end. There are hundreds of them. And I introduced that to my brother, and nowadays, he told me that the very beginning of his education or his familiarity with Western literature was because I introduced him to read the Brothers Grimm stories. Yeah, it was my favorite book when I was very young. And when you look at those stories, more than half of them were very, very terrifying for children to read. So the main mission of children's story is to scare the children to death so that they will behave. I mean that not only for children's stories, but also children's nursery rhymes. If you look at them, most of them are very, very horrifying. The meaning of the word Cinderella, 灰姑娘, is to describe this girl whose attributes were unrecognized. She may be pretty and talented or knowledgeable or whatever, but nobody give a damn. People just don't see her as a human being. They abused her. By they, I mean all her stepmother and the stepsisters. According to the story, sometimes she had two stepsisters and sometimes there are three. And they were quite often the comic relief in these stories in many different versions. They were so stupid and vulgar and ugly. They are just laughing stocks for people to get a laugh while watching the story. And because of their abuse of this beautiful young girl, her attributes were not recognized. Attribute 就是一个人的优点哈，unrecognized So Cinderella, to the people around her, is just a servant who can be called upon to do chores, and they never said thank you to her and never looked at her face and say, oh, there is a pretty face. No, they just thought she was a nobody. Okay. So one who unexpectedly achieves recognition or success after a period of obscurity and neglect. 这个就是说这个故事的主要内容呢，是说 a girl who unexpectedly achieves recognition, 忽然就被人看清她的好处，或者说她就成功了，经过了一段时间都是很默默无名，而且没有人理她，obscurity and neglect, these are all very good words to learn. Obscure 是模糊不清的意思，对一个人来说呢，他就是默默无名的意思，neglect 就是 maybe she has other attributes, but people never look at them. So even now, after 2,000 years, or after 400 years, or after 200-300 years, this story is still very popular because people can be entertained and find that a good person can get ahead, even though it's just by marriage. If there was no prince, then she'll never be recognized. So anyone who is nobody can identify with her and could wish that one day the same good fortune would fall upon them. That's why it's so popular, I suppose. So it became so popular in all kinds of stories and all kinds of music or movies and everything else. Okay. Now we talk about 叶县, According to Wikipedia, one of the earliest Cinderella story was in Tang Chao, in the year 860 AD, in Duan Cheng's collection of folk tales called Youyang Zacu. Okay, and this girl's name is Ye Xian. In this version, it's more or less just a Cinderella story, except that there is a fish. In this story, there's a fish that she found in the pond, I suppose, which was a reincarnation of her dead mother. So she raised this fish, and eventually this fish, with her magic power, was able to change her, maybe dress her beautifully with very nice shoes to a festival where she lost that one of the shoes. So basically, it's a Cinderella story called Ye Xian, but it has a fish that did not appear in any of other version that we know of. So if you want to see this, this was the text of Ye Xian. So this is definitely way before the Italian version or the French version or the German version, by about 1,000 years. Maybe a little less than 1,000 years, but by many hundred years. And as we Chinese were very diligent in keeping all the record and the books, you can trust that it was not influenced by Western versions. Okay, now we come down to this version, which is a musical called Cinderella, made for TV, written by Rodgers and Hammerstein. Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella is a musical written for television, but later played on stage. So after it was made into broadcast on TV several times. Eventually, there were stage production using the same material. And as usual, the music is written by Richard Rodgers, and the book and the lyrics was written by Oscar Hammerstein II. We called him the second because his son, one of his sons at least, is called the third. It's one of the traditions that a father is so proud to have the son that he would name the son the second, but not very often do we see the third, but in this case, there is the third. And we know that there's a boxing champion called George Foreman. He named all his three sons George Foreman. There's no first or second or third. He has such a big ego, or his vocabulary is so limited that he had to name all three sons the same name, which is the same name as his. Okay, and this version by Rodgers and Hammerstein is based on Charles Perrault's version called the Cendrillon, which is in French. And quite a few new movies based on Cinderella claim that they were based on Charles Perrault's Cendrillon. So this is unusual that it was written and to be produced on TV first instead of in other ways. And it was broadcast live in color on CBS in the year 1957 as a vehicle for Julie Andrews, who played the title role. I listed the two other very famous Julie Andrews movies below. Mary Poppins, 1964, for which she won an Oscar, and The Sound of Music in 1965. After these two movies, she became the blockbuster superstar in the movie history. However, in 1957, she was only known in the circle, the Broadway circle. Other regular people never heard of her, and it was Rodgers and Hammerstein who went to Broadway often and realized that there is a big star coming in the future. So they were very happy to write a vehicle for Julie Andrews, even though she was not known in the movie industry. And the fact is, when they made My Fair Lady, which Julie Andrews performed on Broadway very successfully, the big shots, the money people, movie people who have big money, they would not hire Julie Andrews. They did not know Julie Andrews will be a big star. So when they made My Fair Lady, they chose Audrey Hepburn to play Eliza Doolittle. And she was very young. As you can see, she was 22 when she was in Cinderella, but she became famous like 6 or 7 years later. Now let's talk about the duo, Rodgers and Hammerstein. They always write musicals together. Well, I should not say it that way, huh? Okay. They wrote a lot of musicals very successfully together, but before and after and in between, they also collaborated with other people doing some less popular plays, but they were famous as a duo. A duo means a two-people group. who were extremely successful. And in addition to being very successful, they are not just coasting on their popularity. They really get into being innovative, and they want to try to use their influence to deliver some other messages. They want to discuss social issues in their very happy musicals. Usually you watch a musical, it's called a musical comedy. In English, in America, a musical is called a musical comedy because they were all for entertainment, not for serious issue addressing. But they did not just want to entertain people, they want to discuss things. So they experimented with the musical form and with storytelling, and they dealt with social issues as well. They were so successful that together with their work on Broadway and in Hollywood or in any other ways, their movies or their plays together won 34 Tony Awards, 15 Academy Awards, 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and 2 Grammy Awards. So that's how popular they were. 34 Tony Awards, because those musicals were all on Broadway. And the Academy Award was because many of the very popular plays, musicals, were adapted into movies. And there were 2 Pulitzer Prizes. So even before the plays were shown in the movies or shown on Broadway as a book of musical, they won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. For Oklahoma in 1944, in the South Pacific in 1950. Here we list some of their very best Broadway shows. On the left-hand side, the 5 of their very best musicals: Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, The Sound of Music, in chronological order, from 1943 to 1959. These 5 were just, there was no competition. They were the couple, the duo, who were extremely successful on Broadway. And the other lesser popular ones are State Fair, Cinderella, Flower Drum Song, and there are a few others. State Fair, last time when I talk about Dana Andrews, he was in State Fair, which is a musical. So I have seen it before, years and years ago, but I don't recall whether he sings well or not. He's the one I talked about in The Best Years of Our Lives, as the soldier who came back and having nightmare, having a post-traumatic disorder syndrome, PTSD, okay. Post-traumatic syndrome disorder.
Stress.
Stress, okay, stress, okay. Stress, okay. So he was a person playing that soldier. Yeah, he was very unable to adjust to the post-war life. And eventually he found a job at the airport when he was waiting for a flight to nowhere. He did not know where he's going to. And then he found a job in the airport. He became a pretty big star, but when he was in the State Fair, he was quite young. And this musical was later adopted again with Pat Boone and Margaret. I think I've seen both of them. but it's not as famous as those 5 on the left-hand side. We have Oklahoma, Carousel. South Pacific would be 南太平洋, The King and I 是国王与我, with Deborah Carr. And Yul Brynner and The Sound of Music, of course, I'm sure everybody have seen. The others maybe not as big in the mind of people like us who came from Taiwan. For example, Oklahoma. One of my sisters saw Oklahoma in 英语中的 weekend movies. And at that time, I was too young to go there. But after I came to United States in 1969, my sister, the same sister, she took me to Broadway in Lincoln Center to watch Oklahoma. And we paid, I don't know, $1 or $2. We stood in the back of the theater. That was my first Broadway show I attended. And these are very popular, but on the right-hand side, they're less popular. And there's Flower Drum Song, which is translated into 花鼓歌, It was first written by Li Jinyang. The Li Jinyang is one of the famous 8 Li brothers. Their father used to call them Li Jia Ba Jun Ma or something like that. One of the brother was a songwriter who wrote 夜来香 and I don't know, maybe 月亮代表我的心 and things like that. So they were brothers who were very talented and successful, many of them in America. And Li Jinyang was the one who wrote a play, Flower Drum Song, which was adapted into a musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein. It is about a restaurant owner, a Chinese restaurant owner, having a son, and then they mail ordered a bride who came from China to marry the son, and the cultural conflict between them and the family. And it's got Anna May Wong, if you have heard of Anna May Wong. She was a trailblazer for Chinese movie stars. She was very successful and very much discriminated against in Hollywood. She only played an ingenue who's evil, who would kill people or things like that. She died 1,000 times in her movies. That's what she described it. And she died not too long ago and was commemorated in the quarter coin. There were several trailblazing women. Let me put this word here. Trailblazer. It means a person who blaze in the jungle and open up a trail for others to follow. So Anna May Wong was one of those trailblazers. You could say that Leanne would be where she is today without Anna May Wong, because Anna May Wong was the person very early on, since silent movies, she just wanted to be in a movie and she would take any role, most of them minor roles and evil persons, but she just hanging there and did all those things for other Chinese actors to follow. Okay, so if you have a chance to borrow, either to watch it by streaming or go to a library, as I did. I watched this on a DVD from library. That was an interesting story to watch. I watched it maybe 30 years ago, and I did not realize many of the things I know now. Okay, let's talk about the social issues in Rodgers and Hammerstein's works. They discuss serious issues such as racism, sexism, and classism. Classism meaning 阶级 in the society, even in America, people still have different classes. And of course, there's racism and sexism. And as early as they were, they discussed these issues in their works, even though the works are supposed to be cheerful and entertaining and filled with uplifting songs. But they really tried to put those things in their shows. The second on the 5 big list is called the Carousel. I recently watched it again as a stage show, quite recently. It was about a domestic violence story about the father who actually, the father is of course the abuser, but he died early and he went to heaven, and he looked down from heaven in the stars and saw that the child, his daughter, is growing up and so on. So it's quite a sad story, and in it you see two people, young people, fell in love, and then after marriage the husband would abuse the wife. This is definitely not an ideal story to be dealt with in a musical, but they did it in Rodgers and Hammerstein. So it's about domestic violence, and the South Pacific is about racism. I wonder if you have seen that movie with Missy Gaynor and Rossano Brazzi, who's an Italian actor. It was on Broadway, of course. This show was on Broadway with Mary Martin and another, I don't know if he's Italian. The role is about a French person living on one of the Pacific Islands while America was fighting Second World War. And the story is about this young and attractive nurse stationed there who fell in love with this plantation man, French plantation boss. And this boss had a first wife, a local native wife who passed away. So this young nurse fell in love and went to this plantation owner's home and saw these two mixed blood children. And it was very difficult for her to accept this thing. She was from the American South, and she was never exposed to other culture. So it's very difficult for her. And in the end, she came to accept this stepchildren who were of mixed blood, and not in a good way, which I mean, he's not a mixed child of a German and an English person, no, and not an Italian or French, no, but it's a native Pacific Islander mother. That's why she had difficulty accepting. And I really applaud Rodgers and Hammerstein dealing with such issue because of the huge popularity they have. They make millions and millions of isolated-minded people be exposed to the idea of racism, to think about things they have never thought about. Okay, so these are the two issues. And then there's the Von Trapp family in The Sound of Music. As you probably have seen the movie, and you know that it was about an Austrian naval captain who had to flee Nazi-occupied Austria with his family and went eventually to Vermont in the United States. And in the story, you came face to face with what Nazi did. in that part of the world. Many people in America in the early years, they had no idea what Nazi was doing. And they did not know Nazis were killing millions of Jews. And they did not know that Hitler annexed it's a verb and it's a noun. Hitler took his army across the border and annexed Austria. That was before the beginning of the Second World War. This happened first. And secondly, they went to Czechoslovakia, and they occupied that country as well. And the West just watched him, and they say, that is bad, but maybe he's happy now. He's not going to take the next step. And once and twice, and again, he invaded Poland. And at that point, the West decided they could not tolerate that anymore. And they declared war on Hitler. That's how the Second World War began. Okay, so these are the difficult issues that were raised by Rogers and Hammerstein. And of course, Stephen Sondheim took them one step further, much further down the line when he wrote all his musicals dealing with many terrible things, such as Sweeney Todd. We were just talking about Angela Lansbury. She and her play on Broadway received lots of awards for Sweeney Todd. It was about a barber in London, in the city of London, who kills his patrons. People came to him for a haircut, and he slashed their throat and dumped them in the basement, and he and his wife sold meat pie made of these people's flesh. Okay, that is a lot more horrible than these topics dealt with by Rogers and Hammerstein. And we're going to talk about Stephen Sondheim at the end of this class. Okay, so there were two remakes of the Cinderella musical. We went through them just a bit before, and then we're going to go through each and every one of them. Okay, so this one is Julie Andrews. She was born in 1935, and she had quite a few very, very popular movies, including Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music. These are the two biggest movies she ever made. And then she did not make a lot of movies. For people like, say, Kirk Douglas or Christopher Plummer or Burt Lancaster or whatever, those very popular actors, they would make over 100 movies, but not Julie Andrews. With her fame, she made very few movies, and most of them were not successful and were directed by her husband, who divorced his first wife and married her, and they had a long marriage. And as a result, she was in many of her husband's movies, and her husband's name is Blake Edward. And as I mentioned, many of them were not successful. This one I listed 10 was a very popular movie, but in no way can compare with some of her most famous movies. There were Torn Curtain with Paul Newman, which is an Alfred Hitchcock movie, and Hawaii is a James Michener story with Max von Sydow as her husband. These were not bad movies, but not very big. She came back in Victor Victoria, which is also directed by her husband, Blake Edward, and that was a pretty successful movie with James Garner. James Garner plays a big mob boss who fell in love with the singer played by Julie Andrews, and he went to see her show all the time. And Julie Andrews is a cross-dressing woman. She's really a woman, but she plays a man all dressed up as in the tuxedo and the sing and so on. So people thought she was a man, but she was really a woman, while this mob boss played by James Garner, he knew that she is a woman and they had an affair, but everyone else thought he was gay because to them she was a man. So it's a very laughable comedic story about a mobster being so macho, but being thought of as being gay. And the story is called The Victor Victoria because Julie Andrews was playing, she was Victoria, but she was playing a man called the Victor. And after all these stories, in 2001, she started to appear in The Princess Diaries with Anne Hathaway as the Cinderella kind of story. She was found to be the heir of a throne while she was attending high school in the United States. So this is a Cinderella story with a new twist. And Julie Andrews was in that movie, and it's a sequel and the third. I don't know how many sequels it has because it was quite popular, but she in no way plays a major role. It was a supporting role. So when you look at it, she was successful in 3 movies. 2 of them were huge hits. That's why so many people thought she was so successful, but she did not have very many other movies to be claimed as her own. And she's still alive. So now we talk about this production of this TV live broadcast, which is very new at that time. And there were lots of technical difficulties. And even when it was showing live, there were cameras failing. And so some of the stations showed it in black and white, and some showed it in color. And there was nothing recorded during the live broadcast. However, before the live broadcast, there was a rehearsal that they recorded, and it was in black and white. At that time, there was no technology to record it in color, so it was in black and white. That's why we saw this version on YouTube, which is rather a poor production. And it had the largest audience in history at that time, with 107 million people watching it, fully 60% of the country's population. So just about everyone who was watching TV that night was watching this show, nothing else. Okay. And this person, I don't know who he is, John Cipher, he later remembered leaving the studio a few minutes after the broadcast had ended and finding the Manhattan streets deserted because so many had stayed at home to watch the broadcast. So it was an immensely popular one. However, after the show, many people did not like it, but too bad they already saw it. That's the thing with movie. Before you see it, you don't know if you'll like it. After you see it, you cannot get your 2 hours back if you don't like it. So right now, the social media is playing a very important role, because people would go check the social media nowadays before they actually go to see a movie. And that's how a movie can become a huge hit very quickly. This slide says, the broadcast received an extraordinary range of reactions. Some people just loved it so much, while many people hate it so much. And lots of people say, oh, it's okay. A huge spectrum of reactions, subject to significant reservation. Okay. Now we talk about the second one, which is a newer one, less than 10 years. It's 8 years after that. And because it was recorded, it was played again and again on TV in the next 10 years. And I watched one of those in maybe 1972 or 73. That was during the 10-year span that they repeatedly aired it on TV. We had Stuart Damon as the prince, and as always in a Cinderella story, the prince is not the main character. It's entirely the girls' play. Leslie Ann Warren, she was 18. She played the Cinderella, and I think she did a pretty good job. And to make it even better, they got Ginger Rogers and Walter Pidgeon. These two are older people, of course. They played the prince's mother and the father, but they had their wonderful, they peaked in their career. They were very popular for some years, and now they were older and semi-retired. And Celeste Holm was also, she was never as big as Ginger Rogers, but she was recognized, received some nominations, and she was pretty good. And Jo Van Fleet was more or less famous for playing bad women. And in this one, she played the stepmother, of course. She was also the mother in East of Eden, if you have seen John Steinbeck's movie with James Dean and Julie Harris, I think. Anyway, she was in many movies as, say, the pimp in the whorehouse, or evil women. That's Jo Van Fleet. So people don't recognize her name as much. The first broadcast was on February 22nd. There's a rerun. There's a remake, okay, in 1965, which is 8 years later. And it was rebroadcast 8 times through 74. So it was rebroadcast 8 times. And I probably saw one of the later ones. The first time it was shown on TV, the Nielsen rating was 42.3. Nielsen rating was very important for many, many decades. It does a random interview of people who watch TV and ask them whether they watch this or that. And they extrapolate, which means by a random sampling, they multiply it by certain numbers, and they decided 42.3 is a magic number of the percentage of people who watch this show that during that time frame. It was the highest rated show that is non-sports. You know, Super Bowl shows are always very extremely popular. They probably ranked the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on in history of the most popular, most watched shows. So when you talk about other shows, you have to say non-sports special. So they got 42.3, which is very respectable. It's about half of the people who watched the movie at that time watched this show. I think it was a lesser percentage when compared with that Julie Andrews show, because that is half the population, not half the TV watching population. It's the entire population. Half of them were watching Julie Andrews musical. From the beginning of, okay, so this Leslie Ann Warren version was the highest rated non-sport show since the beginning of the Nielsen rating until 2009, until something came along and knocked it off. So it reigned for 30 years. This is a picture of Leslie Ann Warren. She was born in 1946. I find it interesting that when she was 15 years old, she made a tape of herself singing the Queen of the Night aria from the Magic Flute, the only time she sang opera. So she never sang opera before and never sang opera since, but she made a recording of that song, and she was probably discovered by somebody because she was soon in some shows or plays, and especially this one, which was only 3 years later. So she really became known very quickly. And if you're wondering what the Queen of Night aria was, you could, of course, watch the Magic Flute, or you could watch the movie Amadeus, which was a fake biography of Mozart. It has this very famous song. It's a very tricky song and very high notes, high pitch. And as a 15-year-old who has never sang in an opera, it was quite an achievement. So I find that very interesting to mention it. And then she was in many, many other movies, and she was nominated for her supporting role in the movie Victor Victoria, which we just mentioned, with Julie Andrews and I said James Garner, but there's another one, Robert Preston. Robert Preston was the person who went with you can say he was Julie Andrews or Victoria's handler. He was the teacher and the nurturer, and he was really worried that this singer is flirting with the mob boss. And Robert Preston is really, really famous for being the traveling salesman in, what's that called? The Music Man. The Music Man was a very good musical. It came out the same year as West Side Story, and it won more awards than West Side Story. But as years went by, West Side Story became much more famous, while The Music Man, though still quite famous, did not fare as well. So Leslie Ann Warren, in the year 1982, when she was in her late 30s, she was nominated for an Oscar and the Golden Globe and the Film Critics Circle Award for that supporting role in Victor Victoria. So she's a decent actress. And we can talk a little bit about Ginger Rogers. and Water Pigeon and the Celeste Home. Ginger Rogers is probably far more famous than the rest of them. She was in 9 movies dancing with Fred Astaire, and that 9 movies became classics. And the people just loved them dancing together. Of course, people think Fred Astaire is a better dancer, and he was in more dance movies with other people, for example, Audrey Hepburn and Sid Charisse and many other people. But he was most famous for being in a dance movie with Ginger Rogers. Of course, Ginger Rogers was in many other movies, some no singing, some no dancing, just, for example, I saw one recently with Katharine Hepburn. They were a group of aspiring actresses renting an apartment. Well, that was one of her early movies. Of course, later on, she became much more famous and in many more important roles. And that movie picture, the company called RKO, in Chinese, we call it Lei Dianhua. That company made tons of money because of these movies. In fact, they are the same movies. They made a movie called the Happy Divorcee or something like that, or the Married Divorcee. And it was hugely popular. So they made not sequels. They remake many stories with different peoples and different situations, but it's essentially the same movie with the two of them met and with some misunderstanding, and they had an argument and so on. And eventually they made up and they were happy, and there's tons of dancing and singing in those movies, all 9 of them. And Water Pigeon was in some of these famous movies, notably Mrs. Miniver and the Madame Curie, and How Green Was My Valley. He was the very important man in this 3 movies as the head of the household, and with very strong women. Yeah, the first 2 movies had Greer Garson as a strong woman in the movie. Mrs. Miniver, I talked about once. It's about during the Second World War, how the people in London suffered while their husbands went to the war. And so Greer Garson was more important than Water Pigeon. And Madame Curie, of course, Greer Garson was Madame Curie, 就是居里夫人, and she was more important than her husband, and especially when her husband died in the accident. He was crossing the street and knocked over by a horse carriage. At that time, there were no cars on the street, and he was killed in a carriage accident, and she became a widow. And that movie script is famous for having been written by Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley was one of the very early science fiction or dystopia story writers. He wrote the famous Brave New World, about the world being turned into a dictatorship where people don't have any say, don't have any will. They are all being watched by the dictator. That's called the Brave New World. And it's the first of many hundreds and hundreds of similar movies. And Aldous Huxley wrote it, and he's a son, I think he's a grandson of Thomas Huxley, who was a very famous biologist who helped Charles Darwin to win favor from other scientists. Okay, but then Water Pigeon became less and less important, so he appeared in science fiction movies such as Forbidden Planet, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. These are science fiction movies, and by definition, they are level B or B movies. People like to see those movies, even though they're not great. But of course, things are different nowadays. All these fancy, fantastic movies are making so much money that they were able to put in a lot of money to make a huge production out of it. So they became A movies, even though their stories are B level. So he was in Funny Girl with Barbara Streisand and Harry in Your Pocket with James Coburn. He was playing minor roles there. And I bet of these people, you probably haven't heard Celeste Holm, who has a decent career. She lived almost 100 years. And she was nominated as a supporting actress for Academy Award in Elia Kazan's Gentleman's Agreement, which is a story about anti-Semitism. And the leading actor was Gregory Peck and Dorothy McGuire. And Celeste Holm was playing a supporting role, and I don't remember her. I have seen that movie like 50 years ago. Come to the Stable, All About Eve, I've seen at least 3 times. If you have not seen All About Eve, it is important, or I highly recommend you to watch All About Eve. It was a great movie with Betty Davis. Also known, she was also known for these movies, which are quite famous. A Letter to 3 Wives. I mentioned it when I was talking about Joseph Mankiewicz. Yeah, okay. Who probably wrote the script and directed the movie. And High Society is a more popular movie with Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart and Frank Sinatra, with Grace Kelly. Who else is in it? But she is a reporter who is in love with Frank Sinatra. I'm sorry, not Frank Sinatra. With Jimmy Stewart, who is another important actor in that story, even though the main couple was Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. So she did pretty well. She's a good actress, but never became very famous. But this one has Whitney Houston in it, which is just a phenomenal person. I mean, who is Whitney Houston? She is a big singer, and she died by accident. And this movie had Brandy. We usually call her Brandy instead of Brandy Norwood. She likes to be called Brandy. She's a quite famous singer, a young singer when she made this movie. And of course, she played the Cinderella. But Whitney Houston is a little older, even though she was so much more famous. And she played the fairy godmother. And Bernadette Peters played stepmother. And we're going to talk about Bernadette Peters later. And this remake is famous for having each person from a different race. So you have Brandy, who's Black, Whitney Houston is Black, but Bernadette Peters is white. And the prince was played by a Filipino actor, Paolo Montalban. And Whoopi Goldberg is also Black. Victor Garber is white, and Jason Alexander is, I would take a wild guess, a Jewish comedian, but I'm not sure. I have to check. But certainly Jerry Seinfeld is a Jewish comedian, and Jason Alexander was in Jerry Seinfeld, which had 4 main characters, with Julia Dreyfus as the only woman, with 3 men, Seinfeld and Jason Alexander, and a very quirky person. Maybe somebody could tell me the name. She was always jerking and moving around and doing very strange things. Anyway, Jerry Seinfeld is a very, very popular TV comedy series. Every day, the 4 of them would get together every show doing nothing. It's the show about nothing. There's no big story. There's no continuous line. It's just 4 wacky people making jokes. That's all. Okay. And Jason Alexander, of all people, appeared in this version of Cinderella as a herald. A herald is someone in the court who would make announcement from place to place after playing the bugle. That's called the herald. 就是到各地去宣传国王的宣告. Okay. And this role was never a role in any other versions except for this one. They must have added something to it to make it worthwhile for him to appear. Here's a snapshot, 2 snapshots of Brandy as Cinderella and this Filipino actor next to her as the prince, and the father was a regular white guy while the mother is Whoopi Goldberg. Not all the people who watched it liked it. This is Brandy, and I know her very little. She is mostly a singer, and this here says she is known for her distinctive sound, characterized by her peculiar timbre, voice layering, and intricate riffs, which has earned her the title of the vocal Bible. So it must be quite amazing to hear her sing, but I've never heard her sing. I'm sorry about that. And she was respected as the vocal Bible because all the tricks, wonderful things she could do with her voice. And she sold a lot of records and received a lot of awards, but no one can compare with Whitney Houston, maybe except maybe Julie Andrews. Yeah, Whitney Houston is a wonderful singer, and she also appeared in quite a few very good movies. And she is called The Voice. That's her nickname. Instead of being the vocal Bible, she is The Voice, which means there's only one and the only person who could sing like her. She is one of the best-selling music artists of all time and sold over 200 million records worldwide. And one day she was found almost dead in the bathtub in the hotel room, and she was pronounced dead very quickly afterwards. He died drowned in her bathtub in the hotel room, and she had heart problem, and she was doing cocaine, and she was drinking very heavily. So we don't call that an overdose, but accidental death, drowning. Yeah. It's very, very sad because she was such a brilliant young woman when she came out, so virtuous and good behaving and so on and so forth. And she married someone who did not treat her well. And she was in some movies, she's usually mainly a singer, but she was in a few important movies that sold well. There was the Bodyguard with Kevin Costner with a song which she sang. I shall always love you or something like that. Yeah, that song was very popular. And Waiting to Exhale was one of the first novel by, I can't remember her name, but she wrote, she's a Black woman. She's the voice of Black women, because Waiting to Exhale is about a group of Black women who married the wrong man. So they all have their different horror story to tell. So they were passing their day holding their breath because they could not breathe easily. That's called Waiting to Exhale, and it's one of the very early blockbuster movies that's a Black story. It's very rare for an entirely Black people played movie to become so popular. And the same writer continued to write good novels that were made into movies, like How Somebody Found Her Group. I forgot the name of the person. How she lost, apparently she lost her groove, but then she found the groove. I forgot her name. Anyway, The Preacher's Wife had Denzel Washington and Whitney Houston. The two of them were in a remake of a Cary Grant movie, The Preacher's Wife. It's called The Bishop's Wife, with Cary Grant as the angel and Loretta Young as Preacher's Wife. And they made it into a Black one with Black characters. And then there's Cinderella, Sparkle, and the rest are not really movies. It's about her after she died, I think. Let me double check. Okay, she died in 2012. So these two movies were made after she died. And this is Bernadette Peters. She was born in 1948. She's mainly a Broadway actress. She was in numerous Broadway shows and musicals, and she won a lot of nominations and awards. And she was in not too many movies, but quite notable. So she got 2 Tony Awards after nominated 7 times, and the others. Okay, and 4 of the Broadway cast albums she was in won Grammy Awards. So she was a good singer too, and good actress too. She is not one of the most beautiful people in the world. She is kind of a 小家碧玉, huh? So she was not getting the best roles, but she is really good at, for example, playing a witch who is wicked, things like that. So these are the Broadway shows that she was in, and each one was very successful, from On the Town to Sunday in the Park. There were many of them written by Stephen Sondheim. So people say that she is an authority in interpreting Stephen Sondheim, from Sunday in the Park with George, Into the Woods, and Gypsy, and Little Night Music, and Follies. These are all Stephen Sondheim musicals. Stephen Sondheim first became famous when he wrote the lyrics for West Side Story, in which the music was written by Leonard Bernstein. Of course, there's no one who could compete with Leonard Bernstein. He is great writing music in every way. I mean, all genre of music. He was great. And he was, of course, the conductor of New York Philharmonic Orchestra. And also he conducted many lessons you can still see on YouTube. The classes he gave on classical music. That's Leonard Bernstein. That's why Stephen Sondheim wrote only lyrics for that musical called the West Side Story. If you've seen that, you could understand a little bit of how wickedly smart Sondheim was. But after 2 times cooperating with other songwriters, he went on his own and wrote both music and lyrics for many, many plays. We'll talk about that at the end of this class. But Stephen Sondheim, who died very recently, was a force to be reckoned with. So here we talk about Bernadette Peters. He was also, in addition to being on stage, he was in movies and in TV shows. I've seen almost all of her movies, which are few. I saw her in Annie and the Silent Movie and The Jerk. These are all comedies, but Annie is a musical. And she continues to act in TV and film as well. She is recently on TV in the series Smash and Mozart in the Jungle, which is about Metropolitan Opera and orchestra. She has been nominated for 4 Emmy Awards and 3 Golden Globe Awards, winning once. She is regarded by many as the foremost interpreter of the works of Stephen Sondheim. I just mentioned it to you. She was in many of them. Then let's talk about other Cinderella stories, mostly in movies. And a very early one was the Disney cartoon. I hope you have seen several Disney cartoons, starting with Snow White, which is earlier than this, and Cinderella is a second one. And Disney went on to make many more cartoons with strong, well, maybe not strong, with women or girls as the main character. In the beginning, that girl was a not important person. It's just a young and beautiful woman and who happened to have an extraordinary life, not because of her. But then Disney realized that they got something in their hand that they could influence all the girls in the world. Just like Gong Qijun in Japan, he made tons of animated movies with strong female young roles, girls who are 13, 15, or 20, or 18, young girls, very strong characters. And by making animated stories with the main character who is young and female and strong, Gong Qijun and Disney both, they bring up a whole generation after generation of young girls confident in their ability to conquer the world against the difficult situations. And this one early one, Cinderella did nothing. She was just there being pretty and kind and lovely. But later on, Disney movies, cartoons became dedicated to strong women who are young and being in difficult situations. So Cinderella was the 13th Disney animated feature film, but the second with a young woman as the character, as the main leading role. Of course, Disney had, Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, lots of different animals or dogs, the dog movie, and cats, whatever. The Aristocrats and the 101 Dalmatian and the Beauty and the 小姐与流氓, Beauty and what? The Scoundrel?
Beast.
Not Beast.
Oh, it's not Beauty and Beast.
I'm talking about two dogs. The
Mm,
cartoon.
oh.
Beauty and I don't know. One is a like Dalmatian and one is a it's the dog that I had before. The Cocker Spaniel. Okay, the two dogs were in love in the cartoon.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So these are the earlier Disney movies, animated movies, but later on they branch out to make lots of different kinds of movies, including animated movies. Now we talk about Disney princesses. There was Snow White, Cinderella, and after that we have the Sleeping Beauty with Aurora, Little Mermaid with Ariel, I don't know, Beauty and Beast with Belle, Aladdin with Jasmine. So from Aladdin, they decide that they should make movies with people from other parts of the world. So they had Jasmine, who's Arabian, Pocahontas, who's Native American, and Mulan, who's Chinese. And they also made Merida down the line. In Brave, it's a black girl, and Moana, who's probably Tahitian or from the Pacific Islander. And Raja, who's even more recent, last year. And here we have all these princesses in this lineup. You see, all these princesses. Some of them are colored. And the center one was in the blue dress. They were all color-coded. And the one in the blue dress is Cinderella. And the first one was Snow White. You can see the third from left with the yellow skirt and the blue top. And the yellow color is the color of Belle, who is in Beauty and the Beast. However, you may have noticed that I skipped the last one. Elsa and Anna, they were in the animated Disney movie Frozen, and they were not in the lineup as two Disney princesses for several reasons. They were princesses. They can't be in the official lineup, but their movie was just so out of the world. The box office was so high, so way, way, way high that they stood separately as their own. When Disney does the marketing, they don't want Elsa and Anna to be mixed in this group, so they excluded them from the lineup, and they were called the honorary princesses, even though they were princesses. If you have seen Frozen, or if you have ever heard Idina Menzel singing this leading song, the Let It Go, then you know that all over the world, millions of little girls could sing that song, because it really made them feel proud that they could stand up and do what they want. They are the boss. They don't care what other people think. That's the Disney message. And it was hugely successful. And many of these came out lately. And in the beginning, of course, there were no colored ones. And in the year of 2013, when I was in Russia, I took this picture on the window. It's their lineup of Disney princesses. However, at that time, there were, you see, that's in the year 2013. So you draw a line here, at that time, there was already Mulan, almost 10 years, and Pocahontas, and these were colored people. And in Russia, they did not like colored people as princesses. So they only keep these. Okay, that's a very interesting thing to me. And Cinderella is not appearing only in animated movies or musicals. There are regular live movies that feature the same story. And I have 3 of them highlighted in red. The Glass Slipper, which I actually saw, but I was too young. I was probably 10 years or younger. Well, actually, I was less than 10 years old when it came out. It has Leslie Caron and Michael Wilding. I just remember they were dancing on a huge cake. The entire stage is a wedding cake, and they were dancing around the cake. And at that time, I remember Leslie Caron was playing Cinderella, but only later I realized that Michael Wilding, whom I never saw since or before, was Elizabeth Taylor's 3rd husband, or one of those husbands, maybe 2nd husband. I think her 3rd husband was died in a plane crash. Yeah, he was a movie producer, and then later he married Debbie Reynolds' husband, Eddie Fisher, and then he married Richard Burton twice, and in between he married someone else. Anyway, that's Michael Wilding. He's an older gentleman in this movie playing the prince, who is really a little bit too old for that role. But in 1976, we had The Slipper and the Rose, which is a real movie that you can see for free on YouTube, and I watched it the other day. And it had it's a musical too, with different songs, and it's got Richard Chamberlain, who is a big star at that time. He was in The Thornbird and some other shows. And anyway, he was extremely popular on TV, so we did not hear a lot about him early on. He was in Dr. Kildare, which was all the girls were crazy about him. But after several decades, he came out as being gay. He was very handsome, but in the beginning, they did not dare to tell people that he's gay. That movie was a pretty good production, with the scenery, the costume, everything was quite up to a certain level. However, I did not like the story very much, but we'll talk about Into the Woods, which is a Stephen Sondheim musical, or we'll talk about that later. Now, this is a Cinderella. It's a reverse Cinderella movie, because the main character, called the fella, which means a fellow, is played by Louis, Jerry Lewis and Martin. What's his first name? We call Martin and Lewis, Martin Louis. Dean Martin, yeah, Dean Martin. People loved Jerry Lewis. I don't know why. They just love him making stupid jokes. And when they broke up, people say, "Oh, Dean Martin is going nowhere. Without Jerry Lewis, he's not going to be in any movie or whatever." But he came to be her own, and he was a big singer, and he was in very good movies with John Wayne and so on. Yeah, he was in many movies, and he had a successful career. But Jerry Lewis was not as successful as many people imagined he would be. But he was hugely popular in France. French people loved him very much. In this movie, he, as usual, is doing slapsticks. He was playing a stupid guy who was a nobody, and a princess married him, so he became a prince. And Edwin played the fairy godfather instead of the fairy godmother. And we did talk about him a little earlier. He was the old feller in Mary Poppins who was so happy that he floated into the air and was on the ceiling having tea parties. And this movie, I just said I did not like it too much, but you're welcome to watch it on YouTube. It's free with Richard Chamberlain. It has a lot of stories. You know, the original Rodgers and Hammerstein musical lasted only 1 hour and a few minutes. And this is a regular feature-length movie that is quite long with lots of happenings, lots of people and lots of stories. But it's mainly to show up Richard Chamberlain, who is a very handsome man at that time. And this movie called Ever After had Drew Barrymore playing the part of Cinderella, but she is called Danielle in this movie. And most people think about this movie as a modern post-feminist interpretation of the Cinderella story, because Cinderella story is so simple and the woman in it is so insignificant. You hardly hear her say anything or do anything extraordinary. So the people have always wanted to put a new twist on this story, and Drew Barrymore, who else but Drew Barrymore would be in this movie? Yeah, I've seen this movie too. To me, it's more interesting than the Richard Chamberlain movie. And Drew Barrymore has a last name that is very famous in Hollywood. Many of her uncles and aunts and the parents and so on were in movie and were big stars. And yeah, she's okay in this movie. This movie I've never heard of, called Cinderella, with Kathleen Turner as Claudette. So who is Claudette? I don't know. I have not watched this movie, but Kathleen Turner, being very much a strong woman on her own, would necessarily be in a movie about Cinderella in some extraordinary ways. Okay, so it follows the original storyline, but it's based in the modern world full of fashion and technology, so that people would really, lots of people like to make movies with a twist. I've been in London going to Shakespeare shows, many of them, and many of them, especially Henry V, they would have a person with a huge tank on the stage, with people all dressed as if it were World War II or things like that. Or I've seen Othello, of course, played with a Black person as Othello. And the wonderful, elegant Desdemona, who married him, was dressed in a T-shirt. And that's how people wanted to show that this is different. I'm doing something that is old, but I want you to take notice that I am different. So I've seen quite a few of those with a Black actor, Adrian Brody. I'm sorry, it's not Adrian Brody. Adrian Brody is white or Jewish. Adrian Lester, he is Black. Yeah, he was in many Shakespeare plays as the leading character. When in Shakespeare's time, there were no Black people on stage, I suppose. Okay, now this is another twist. Amy Adams is in this live person show about Cinderella. She was an animated princess in cartoon. She was supposed to be a cartoon figure from that story, but she escaped into New York City, climbing out of a manhole. And she is a live person. It's quite a twist. And on the left-hand side of this poster, we have James Marsden, who chased after, who was playing an animated prince, chased after Cinderella, and also came into New York City and became a live person, while Cinderella, as a person, a live person, fell in love with the person on the right, who was played by Patrick Dempsey. So that's quite a twist, but it was also a Disney movie with Amy Adams playing Giselle, who is Cinderella. And notable among the cast are other fairly famous people. We have Susan Sarandon as Queen, Edward's evil stepmother. Okay, so in our regular Cinderella story, the prince's mother is not evil or is not anything, because she hardly spoke a word. But in this story, Susan Sarandon plays the prince's evil stepmother. Okay, so the prince also has a stepmother. So there are two evil stepmothers. And Julie Andrews is a narrator, so she is somehow still related to this movie. They wanted her to be the narrator. And Idina Menzel, you probably have not heard until today. I just mentioned that Idina Menzel sang the song Let It Go in the movie Frozen. She became quite famous for doing that, even though she was an actor and singer for a long time. She really hit it big by singing the song in Frozen. And she was also in another Cinderella movie later I'm going to talk about. So that's Idina Menzel. And I saw her in a TV show called what's it called? It's about high school, Glee Club. Yeah, Glee. Okay, Glee, Glee. Yeah, the show is called Glee. It's about a high school music teacher teaching all these high school kids to become big singers. And every show they would produce a big production of singing on stage. And Idina Menzel was in that TV show. It was quite popular more than 10 years ago. And this is another Disney movie. It is the true, real Cinderella, the traditional story with very little twists. And it was directed by Kenneth Branagh, who did a lot of Shakespeare's. And Lily James was the new girl, and you just look at her waist, how skinny that waist was. I could not believe anybody could have a skinny waist like that, especially a white person. You probably could find them in Vietnam. They were all skinny girls, but a white person, that's not possible. That's Lily James. She's quite lovely. And she went on to be in quite a few other important movies. But Kate Blanchett is the queen of, in the movie industry. She played Queen Elizabeth many times, and she won lots of Oscars, and she was in many reputed popular movies, and she played the stepmother. And as always, the prince is hardly anybody paid any attention to the prince. And here we have fairy godmother played by Helena Bonham Carter. And this is even later than all those movies. It's last year, Cinderella. And it's an Amazon production. Right now we have all kinds of streaming companies putting out shows, plays, and TV series. And this one has a Latina, a girl of Latino ancestry playing Cinderella. Her name is Camila Cabello. And we have Idina Menzel as well in this movie as a stepmother. And Minnie Driver first came on to the scene in Good Will Hunting, which is a vehicle by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. They made their play into a movie, and they wanted to hire somebody to play this girlfriend, and they found Minnie Driver, who's from England, and she was later in quite a few important movies. And as always, the parents of the prince are usually played by big stars who are no longer big stars. You have Pierce Brosnan, who was, among other things, in many Bond movies, James Bond 007, and is no longer 007, of course. And James Corden, maybe you haven't noticed, he is really, really funny and so versatile. He came from England, and he was a comedian, and right now he was one of the late night shows host, and he already declared that he was going to finish the show pretty soon. So he had probably 8-year run of a good late night show. You know, during the Trump administration, all the comedians hit it big. Every comedian is poking joke night after night about Trump, and James Corden happened to be one of them. And you I don't know if you watched any midnight shows, late night shows. I've watched a lot at that time. Every day I watched, whether it's Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert. Actually, Jon Stewart retired just before that. So you see Trevor Noah, and you see Stephen Colbert, you see, what's that guy? I was just thinking about him a while earlier. I'll come up with his name. And James Corden was one of those. So in late night, you would, Sis Meyer, it was the name I was looking for, Sis Meyer. And all these wonderful people cracking jokes that make your miserable life happier, because Donald Trump is taking the country to the dump, and we need some laughs. And James Corden was one of them here. And on his late night show, he had a special bits called the taxi karaoke or karaoke taxi. He would invite someone, for example, Paul McCartney, to be a passenger in his taxi. He would drive him around, and they would sing one song after another. And he knew so many songs. And if you go on YouTube and search for his shows, there were medleys of many musicals that he was in there with many famous people. He is just so talented. He is not handsome. He was not particularly smart as a comedian. I mean, he always played a dumb comedian. Okay, you thought he was dumb, but he has to be very smart in order to be so good at playing such a dumb person. So James Corden is a name to be reckoned with. And then there are more than 2 operas, but these 2 eventually became famous. There were earlier ones, and then when these 2 finally came, the earlier ones were forgotten by people. And this one was Rossini's La Cenerentola. Rossini is an Italian opera composer. So this Cinderella story is called the La Cenerentola. This is the final scene when they got married. And another one is Massenet, and he is Jules Massenet, or Jules Massenet is French. So his opera is called Cendrillon. And the last thing I kept saying I'm going to talk about last is Stephen Sondheim and his play Into the Woods. This is one I really wish you could have seen it if you haven't. And the stage recording is available, and there is a remake as a real movie with Meryl Streep. And of course, we have Bernadette Peters as a witch in the Broadway version, and Meryl Streep plays the same role. And my granddaughter was the witch in their high school production. They did a abridged version of that musical. The musical was music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim and the book by James Lapine. In this story, they combined at least 4 of Brothers Grimm's fairy tales into one with a big twist. They don't tell the stories straight. For example, the Cinderella movie, it is after Cinderella got married and became not happily ever after, and she escaped from the palace into the woods. So that's the part about Cinderella. And there are parts about Little Red Riding Hood, 小红帽, or Jack and the Beanstalk, 杰克与魔豆. And the Rapunzel, the Disney version would be called Tangled. This is a girl with very long hair, and Rapunzel is her name. If you know Stephen Sondheim, you know he's got something coming up. He wants to deal with a lot of things in a sarcastic way. He wants to make regular things abnormal. He wants to be very cynical about things. So he covered all these topics such as growing up, parents and child, accepting responsibility, morality, and wish fulfillments and its consequences. So that's a lot of things to be dealt with 4 stories in fairy tales that went wrong. It's about things that went wrong. The person who wrote the script and the songs, well, not songs, okay. The script, the story, okay. The songs and the lyrics were written by Stephen Sondheim, but James Lapine wrote the story. And he said that the most unpleasant person, the witch, would have the truest things to say, and the nicer people would be less honest. So you see the nice people like princess and the princess and so on. Just about everyone is a prince or princess, and they are not really honest to themselves or to other people. While the witch says, I'm not good, I'm not nice, I'm just right. And that's a line delivered by Bernadette Peters. And this play later became a movie rather late, like 20 years later. And it has Meryl Streep playing the witch. And it's got lots of people in it. You've got Emily Blunt, James Corden, again, James Corden playing the baker who could not have a child, and Kendrick as Cinderella, and Chris Pine is a leading man in Wonder Woman with Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. Tracy Woman is a comedian, but she was in a lot of quite good movies too. And Johnny Depp, of course, you probably have heard of Johnny Depp. So these people all enjoy doing something different in this musical, Into the Woods. So if you have the opportunity to see it, all 3 versions, the original Broadway play musical, 2 of them, okay, the musical and this new remake, they are all on streaming if you can find them, but I could find all of them from the library as well. So we'll just talk about Stephen Sondheim as we close up. He died, I think, in January or something this year. And he was born in 1930. So everybody has a relatively long life nowadays. That's almost 90 years. He's an American composer and a lyricist, and one of the most important figures in 20th century musical theater, because he took a huge step forward into the future. He did not settle like everything as usual. He wants to stir up things and make people surprised. Okay, so I could not find one word, so I highlighted the entire sentence. Stephen Sondheim was credited for having reinvented the American musical with shows that tackled unexpected themes that range far beyond traditional subjects. And where was I? That range far beyond the traditional subject, with music and lyrics of unprecedented complexity and sophistication. Usually a musical aims to be entertaining and popular, so they don't want to get into difficult things. The things cannot be too complex, and if they want sophistication, they can go watch an opera. They're here to see the musical because they want some good old-fashioned fun. But Stephen Sondheim really surprised them and took them into a different world. His shows addressed darker, more harrowing elements of human experience, with songs often tinged with ambivalence about various aspects of life. That's what they say after he died. He wrote the first two on this list, which is maybe the 3 or 4 of the musicals he wrote lyrics for, but the rest of them he wrote entirely by himself, with lyrics and songs all by himself. To be honest, I don't like his music very much. They're not very tuneful. It's not something that you would instantly love. For example, in My Fair Lady, I was often walked down the street before. And according to the writer, that song was always the first one people loved. They went to the play and they fell in love with that song. And then gradually they learned to like other songs that are more complicated. But Stephen Sondheim, just about none of his songs are so hummable that you may come to love some of them later, but when you first heard them, they were not very tuneful. But he come to be respected and loved by the entire industry for what he did. Okay, so you could, as a start, try to watch Into the Woods. It is very, very wicked and smart. And we have Sweeney Todd, which the barber who did the human meat pie, yeah. And the next movie would be The African Queen. Nowadays, you just go to YouTube and type in The African Queen. You will be able to find the movie. It is 1951 with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. That was a wonderful movie about something happened in Africa in probably during World War II. Yeah, because in the end, they sunk a German torpedo in the lake, probably Lake Victoria. Anyway, so I was mentioning that in the beginning, probably before people came in, that my next travel talk is coming back to this Saturday on October 22nd. initially they placed someone else, and they changed mine to November 5th and 12th. And then that somebody, the doctor who was going to give a talk this Saturday, he contracted COVID-19 and decided not to do it 3 days from now. So I'm going to pick up where I left behind, which is Costa Rica. Yeah, we're going to talk about Costa Rica at 10 a.m. on this Saturday. Thank you very much. I could only see Uchi, and she would nod and occasionally give some names that I forgot, but I wish someone else would say something too. Did you like this movie? Anything else to say?
Nobody else gonna talk?
Yeah, it's very
I-
nice, and the music is so great. I saw the concert that one too. The singers, the voice is so beautiful, so nice.
Yes.
I enjoy
She
it.
sings so effortlessly. There's
Yeah.
no one like her at all. Yeah.
Yeah, the voice is so nice, so beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
that was
Yeah.
several years before she